Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com. Hey, so today on the show, we've got Josh Cogswell.
Yes. So
And we're going to be
excited about this.
talking about workplace ostracism.
Yeah. Tough topic, but such an important one. So what are some of the big things we're going to talk about in the podcast today, Chris?
Okay, and stop looking at me like, of course you know about ostracism. You're probably a flippin' expert, no research required.
Clearly, you've been ostracized your entire life, Chris.
All right. So we're going to talk about what is ostracism and why does it matter in the workplace?
Yeah.
And I mean, that broadly, why does it matter other places too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why it matters and the outcomes of ostracism and what leads to ostracism and implications for individuals, leaders, and organizations. So awesome.
This is going to be just a great conversation. And before we get to hear from the man himself, let's talk a little bit about who Josh is. So Josh Cogswell is an assistant professor of management at Nicholls State University, where he teaches courses in organizational behavior and human resource management. His research interests include concepts related to positive psychology, leadership, and team dynamics. Josh's work has appeared in peer-reviewed academic journals such as the Journal of Applied Psychology and the Journal of Positive Psychology. Prior to his current position, Josh spent over 15 years in leadership roles in journalism and nonprofit fundraising. Really a cool background you've got there, Josh. And he holds a PhD in management from the University of South Alabama Mitchell College of Business. Josh, welcome to the Indigo Podcast.
Yes. This is going to be so great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Chris. I'm really honored to be here. I'm very humbled too. I've been listening to the show for a long time, and the quality of some of your other guests makes me wonder a little bit why I'm here today, because they're amazing folks. But I really appreciate it, and thanks so much for having me on today.
Oh, you bet, Josh. And, you absolutely deserve to be here. And I'll have to mention that Josh was actually one of our winners of the little contest we held with Stephen Rogelberg's book. So he contacted us right away, and we got to know him a little bit, and we sent him a book. And along the way, realized that he has this really interesting area of research that we're going to focus a little bit on today. And that's this area of ostracism. And Josh he was a co-author on a really great meta-analysis, which for those of you who aren't aware, a meta-analysis is where you look at results across a whole bunch of different papers, different studies, and you quantitatively try to see what's going on. That's the idea.
It's Cliff Notes for smart people.
Yeah. It's
you get the Cliff Notes if you're not smart. If you're smart and don't want to do all the work, you get the meta-analysis.
Yeah, but it is a really
That's
great
right.
way for the scholarly community to try to coalesce around some different findings given a certain topic. And so, the focus of today's conversation is on this meta-analysis that he and his co-authors published in 2019 in the Journal of Applied Psychology called The Antecedents and Outcomes of Workplace Ostracism, a meta-analysis. So I think that kind of brings us to this first point, which is, when we talk about ostracism, what is it?
Sure. First, thanks for mentioning my co-authors, Ben. Matt Howard and Mickey Smith are really brilliant researchers at the University of South Alabama. A note to any grad students listening out there: if your advisor asks you if you might want to help out on a meta-analysis, the answer is yes.
Yes.
It may end up in JAP, and it may end up getting you invited to be on the Indigo podcast.
That's right.
So Matt and Mickey, I really owe a lot to them for inviting me to be part of this project. But to answer your question, Ben, the concept of ostracism is a very old one. It actually goes back to ancient Greece. In in ancient Greece, they actually used ostracism to exclude people who had authoritarian tendencies or undemocratic or anti-democratic tendencies. They used it to kick them out of the democracy and the decision-making process for the community.
God, that sounds like such a fantasy come true. Oh my God. I'm there. Let's talk more about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So that's where the origins of the term come from. And it's been used by cultures throughout history to exclude or shun somebody who's violating rules of the community, of the social group. And so in the workplace context, it's a little subtler. It's really more about more subtle forms of exclusion or ignoring somebody at work.
Yeah. So Chris, have you ever been ostracized in your life?
Yeah, no, I totally. So growing up, my dad was in the Air Force. And so we would move school after school after school. And I knew that my little mind would be furiously racing to try to pick up on the behavioral norms in those first few days of school. And I'd inevitably have gaffes. The teacher calls on you to try to include you. And you want to be like, listen, lady, don't call me for 2 weeks. Okay. I'm still trying to figure out, but you would pick up on that, like the accent, like I didn't say, all those kinds of things. And then also just developed a penchant for books and music. And I would just down the rabbit hole in that stuff. And my peers just were not on that wavelength with me. And that did set up different types of social things that, I adapted, and like in high school, people would say, well, he's more notorious than unpopular. So, there's sort of these things, but it was psychologically really painful for me, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people could probably resonate with that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
I'm sure. Yeah. So ostracism is it's a perception, right, of being excluded or ignored at work. And then, so it's kind of in the eye of the beholder, I suppose, to some degree. But you also mentioned that it's a behavior, right?
Right. Absolutely. So, essentially, we look at it from those two dimensions. So, most of the literature, most of the research on ostracism in the work literature is on that perception, right? So, Chris's example of feeling like he doesn't belong, like he's being excluded. But it also can be a set of behaviors that is perpetrated by some perpetrator in your social context. So, for instance, you walk into a room and people get up and walk out when you enter. In Chris's example, when he walked into the lunchroom, maybe in that first week of school, people not allowing you to sit there.
You got it. Don't sit here, buddy. And you're like,
right.
Where the heck?
Yeah. This is the Forrest Gump on the bus, right? Seats taken.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's the behavioral side. So it's this social psychological phenomenon, right? So it happens in your mind. There are psychological consequences, and there are also behavioral things that happen that cause this in our social environments.
Interesting. So, one other kind of related topic or related, I guess, framework that you talk about is this idea of victimization. So how does that kind of play out with this idea of ostracism?
Sure. So, most of our ideas about ostracism really come from this idea, as we were talking earlier, about how essentially the group is trying to punish someone for violating the rules, right? Violating those norms of behavior that Chris talked about. And so the victim in this case would be someone we would call a provocative victim, somebody who's provoked some sort of response from the social group. And then the group would then respond and ostracize them, or, as a form of punishment to get them in line, right? To say, you can't come back into the group until you've gotten your behavior, gotten your performance back in line with our expectations. But the other aspect of the victimization framework is that essentially that there are people that fall into these roles of the submissive victim and the dominating perpetrator, right? That there are certain people that sort of fall into these roles in the workplace. So that in that case, the behavior of the perpetrator, the behavior of the person who's excluding or punishing the other person is simply, because they want to be dominant. They want to assert their dominance and their power over the other person, not necessarily because it's aimed at trying to bring somebody in line with the group's expectations, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like if you're sitting on a lifeboat, right? And the ship's gone down and they see you swim over and like, okay, we got room for one more, but here's the deal. We're kind of full. So our group norm is don't rock the boat because we don't want to lose the boat. Well, that's a good norm, right? I don't know if we call that ostracism, except it's like not being a numbskull, right?
Right.
But if you come in, I remember when I moved to, you're a University of South Alabama. When I moved to Huntsville, Alabama with my parents, I was like middle school and like, hey man, Auburn or Alabama? And I'm like, sure. I don't even like football. I like soccer. I mean, I'm already set up for failure here, right? Like, no, man, you don't understand. Auburn or Alabama? And it's like you pick one, so only half of the state hates you. If you don't pick either one, you probably should go to Tennessee. Huh? Right? So one is survival.
Right, sure.
Norms aren't bad.
Not necessarily.
Right. But some norms are just about signaling affiliation with a group. And a lot of those things, and this is what we're learning with some of the anti-racism movement and a whole bunch of other behaviors that we look about women in the workplace and some of these norms just, what was that movie? Oh, Brother, We're Out There? Just make no sense, right? They just don't.
Right,
they're
absolutely.
pointless. Who cares if you like football in the end,
Yeah.
So,
Right.
I mean, my friends from Alabama are stoning me right now. I'm going to get hate mail, but that's like, but here's the other thing, right? Is sometimes, especially like, and we've all seen, maybe somebody's been like the brunt of jokes like all the time, or they're the office, numbskull. That can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So then you take somebody that's just been through this psychological wrung out gauntlet. They have no self-esteem left. Nobody's esteemed them at all. And then they show up someplace and they're like, man, we really like this guy. He's interesting. He may not be able to see that love and acceptance, right? Because he's lost in the sauce of all the rejection and ostracism he's had for forever. And so that's this idea of like this purposeful and non-purposeful. So somebody comes in the room and it's like, oh, shoot, I forgot a pen, and just turns around. That guy's probably thinking, oh my God, they hate me.
Right. Sure. Absolutely. And it's connected to really something that we all share, our drive to bond, right? Our need for belonging. It's a deep psychological need we all have, and we all possess it to different extents, but we all need to belong, right? So, back in our early days as humans, the guy who wanted to fight the woolly mammoth by himself, his genes probably didn't pass along.
He either
to
made
the
a
next
tribe
generation,
of like insane warriors, or not going to play anymore in the human gene pool. Right?
Yeah.
Right.
The woolly mammoth won.
That's right. So, social connection is central to our survival as a species, and so it's very important to each of us. And so, to the extent that we walk into a room and somebody walks right out, we sort of start to question ourselves and think about, why did they walk out? Am I not one of the in-group? Am I not part of the group? So in some cases, you mentioned non-purposeful ostracism, purposeful ostracism. In some cases, for instance, with purposeful ostracism, we're deliberately trying to exclude someone until they've gotten their behavior back in line, right? Whereas non-purposeful is something that we perceive in our environment. So you walking into the room and people moving their lunch trays, maybe, they had no intention to exclude you, but you feel excluded. You perceive yourself being apart from the group. And that can have some really important consequences, even though the people on the other side may not have intended for that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think it's just so interesting to think about this in the context of the workplace, right? We've kind of been talking a little bit about as a kid, maybe going through school, and certainly that's a huge just minefield of ostracism and popularity contests and all that other gunk that oftentimes gets caught up as goblins and gremlins in our memories. But it also plays a big role in the workplace because the workplace is another one of those places in which even all of us as adults oftentimes get some fulfillment of our socio-emotional needs. And when we feel ostracized, either purposefully or not, it can be painful, I imagine.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's, and that's primarily, we've studied it from the perspective of the victim, and we found a lot of really interesting stuff. And this is, going back a long way. A lot of other researchers have looked at this, but there are a lot of really important personal outcomes related to ostracism. So, for instance, literally, they've done MRI studies looking at the brain while being ostracized. So, people were asked, for instance, to play a video game where they were passing a ball around in this video game, and the person was ultimately excluded from the game. And the same regions of the brain lit up that light up when you're experiencing physical pain. And so it's truly physically painful to be excluded, even in a minor instance like that of this ball tossing game. It can be very painful. And, you've heard of the cold shoulder, right? That is a ostracizing behavior, right? Where you turn your shoulder to somebody, you ignore them, you're silent toward them. Well, people have actually reported feeling physically colder having been ostracized. So the cold shoulder is a real phenomenon. I don't know if you guys have ever experienced that in life and marriage and at work.
The cold shoulder. Like, there's no loving for you tonight, buddy. I'm going to bed. The kids wore me out. No, that's not ostracism. That's just reality.
Yeah.
But let's talk about there's three pieces in this victimization model, right?
Yeah.
We've got mistreatment, incivility, and actual ostracism. So let's just go down there for our listeners. Let's start off with mistreatment. So define mistreatment here.
So mistreatment is really a broad category of behaviors that are designed to hurt or mistreat another person in the organization. So think of things like verbal harassment, even physical assault, all the way down to these subtler things like gossiping about your colleagues, telling rumors, spreading rumors about them. So mistreatment is this big sort of umbrella of all kinds of different behaviors that are meant to hurt or exclude or mistreat someone. Incivility is a little more subtler form of that. It's essentially behaviors that violate social norms are often subtle and they're low intensity in nature. So things like the gossip that we talked about, excluding somebody, not inviting somebody to a meeting, that might be more incivility. Interrupting, these sorts of behaviors would be incivility. But ostracism is a specialized form of these types of mistreatment. And it's also subtle, like incivility, and it's often ambiguous and low intensity in nature. So somebody might do something to you that you think is excluding you, but it might be ambiguous what their intent is, right? Mm-hmm. So you talked earlier about somebody walking out of the room because they forgot their pen at their desk. Well, if I'm the person who's left in the room wondering where you went, your behavior is a little ambiguous to me, right? But I may interpret it as you're excluding or ignoring me. That's ostracism.
Plausible deniability. Man,
Right,
I don't
right,
know what you're
absolutely.
talking about. You're just insensitive. And then you say it with a
Right.
body language that's like, go jump in a lake, Jack Wag. You're like, I knew it was ostracism. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's much more ambiguous. It's harder to sort of figure out. And people who theorize about this believe that we have what we call a very overly sensitive detector for ostracism because it is so important to us to belong to the social group. We over detect instances of ostracism. So when you walk out of the room to go get your pen, I might think that's a very ambiguous. Oh, he's just walking out to get his pen. But my brain immediately, because I have this strong need to belong, it's going to start thinking, "Gosh, why did he leave?"
Yeah.
It's going to start turning those wheels in my brain.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And as you were talking about these different types of the mistreatment, then incivility and ostracism, it just made me think, this very subtle nature of some ostracism almost makes it worse psychologically in some ways because it's like you're trying to figure out, you don't really know, but you're kind of maybe hardwired to kind of have a bias towards thinking that it is ostracism, and it just messes with you. It's like, hey, if someone comes up and punches you, kind of what's going on.
Yeah.
But
You're like,
if it's
Right.
this other stuff, it can just be really icky because we as humans, we just don't really like ambiguity and uncertainty to a large degree. And when it's uncertainty or ambiguity around how you fit in with a group, that just sounds and I'm sure the research seems to suggest that it's like we said, painful and has some pretty negative outcomes. So while we started talking about it a little bit, why don't we turn our attention there to some of these outcomes of ostracism? You mentioned how it actually has similar outcomes to pain, like when we witness someone who's going through ostracism, the cold shoulder. What are some of the other things that we know from the research on outcomes of ostracism?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned very well there, it's corrosive, right? It's corrosive to our psychological health and well-being. It's corrosive to groups in terms of holding groups together and organizations as well. So we found that ostracism was related to a wide variety of negative outcomes, right? So performance, both your in-role performance, but also your OCBs. I think you guys have talked a little bit about organizational citizenship behavior on the podcast in the past. All those sort of extra things that you do to help the organization above and beyond your role, people are less likely to do that, to do those things when they've been ostracized. There was a positive relationship with counterproductive work behaviors. So people sort of act out, and they act out in negative ways when they've been ostracized. So that idea that we use ostracism as social control, where we're trying to improve people's behavior or get it back in line with social norms, it just doesn't hold up. It's a very ineffective way of helping people to perform better.
Yeah, it's bull.
Yeah.
It's freaking bull.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, so people talk about gaslighting, right?
Mhm.
That's where you trick somebody. It's like, hey, man, I just saw a red car go by. And everybody saw it. And you're like, no red car went by. That car was blue, right? And the people, it's crazy making. Ostracism is a physical gaslighting. It's not just verbal and mental crazy. I mean, this is actual psychosocial group, in group, out group. I mean, this is a physical reality gaslighting. And in my view, it's a type of violence against the individual that's insidious. It takes therapy a while to cure. And just don't do it if you're doing it. It's not, if you learn that from some parenting behaviors or your family of origin, let me just tell you, you got to dump that garbage. It's unhealthy. It's bad. Don't do it with your kids. And anyway.
Yeah.
And
even though we might be, from an evolutionary psychology perspective, hardwired to do this to people who aren't conforming to our norms, as a management tactic, this is not good performance management, right? You don't use ostracism to show somebody that they're not performing well, right?
Yeah, this is like a Lindsay Lohan movie, Mean Girls, right? Remember that stuff? Ostracism. I mean, if it was corny back then, it's corny now. So don't do it.
Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So
Right. So those are some of the ways that, that ostracism is just a bad idea and doesn't work. But it goes beyond just role performance. It really hurts people psychologically. It's affected to people's self-concept and their self-perceptions, their psychological well-being, their emotional state. So it goes beyond just those work-related things. It's related to a wide variety of negative psychological outcomes. And ultimately, from an organizational perspective, it's also related to turnover. And so turnover, as you guys know, is expensive and it hurts the company. And so, to the extent that you're really forcing people out in this ostracizing way, you're forcing them into the out group. Well, they internalize that and they then want to leave the organization. And so it can really hurt the organization and hurt the individual and spill over into their private life as well.
Yeah. And we kind of have a word for that in the world of human resources. We call it constructive discharge, right? This is when you are making the work environment so intolerable that a person quits on his or her own accord, right? So if you're using ostracism to do that, shame on you.
It's a moral failure. And we only have to add the cash incentive because there's lots of moral failures in management positions. So if you only care for the money, just stop doing it. We'll take the result no matter which way. But you just got to, check yourself before you wreck yourself. Another good episode of ours, by the way.
Indeed. Right. Absolutely. So there's all these negative outcomes of ostracism for us personally, for our fellow humans, for their own psychological well-being, for their performance at work, certainly for their perception of the organization and, for their intention to remain even part of the organization. So maybe we could talk a little bit now about, so what leads to ostracism and maybe what are some implications that we should really take away either as, individuals or some things for leaders and organizations here?
Sure, absolutely. So there are a few things we looked at. We looked at the first being personal characteristics. So personality, we looked at the Myers-Briggs type indicator. Just kidding, guys. I know you're big fans of that.
I have my box of rocks here ready to throw. Eat these tomatoes.
Chris looked like he was maybe not paying attention, so I just wanted to make sure.
We're about to see some non-citizenship behaviors happen on this podcast.
Well played.
So now that you guys are paying attention, we did look at some of those characteristics in terms of the big 5 personality dimensions. And so there were some modest correlations there. So ultimately, what we were looking at again is perceived ostracism or the experience of perceiving ostracism on the part of the victim. So this is people reporting that they've been ostracized. And so we found that there was a correlation between, for instance, neuroticism and reporting ostracism. So people who are less emotionally stable tend to report a little bit more. Extroversion was negatively related. So extroverts tend not to be or at least perceive themselves to be as excluded. Agreeableness. So people who don't like conflict, who want to get along, they're going to be less likely to perceive ostracism. They're probably good at kind of ingratiating themselves with the group, right? And then conscientiousness was negatively related to reports of ostracism as well. So those were some of the personal characteristics that did matter to reports of ostracism. Interestingly, we found no correlation with things like political skill. So your ability to kind of read the political dynamics and align yourself with the right faction, that was unrelated. Need to belong and future orientation had no correlation there. So all of this really matters because we've tended to focus again on the victim and the victim's perception of being ostracized. And really what we need to focus on as an antecedent or a predictor of ostracism is actually leadership. So leadership was most strongly related with ostracism. LMX, so your exchange, leader member exchange, your relationship with your supervisor was highly negatively correlated with being excluded or ignored by the group.
Yeah, nobody craps on the boss's pet.
Right.
You know, you're like, dude, Steve's in with the boss. Don't hack him off. Well, they'll be smoking and joking out back. And be like, yeah, that Paul guy, axe him. He's horrible. All right, let's do that when we go back in.
And even going beyond that, I think that, oftentimes the way we characterize leader member exchange is as an index of relationship quality between a leader and his or her followers. And so if you have a leader who has high quality relationships with each and every one of his or her followers, then sure, you're going to have less ostracism, and that's really good. One thing that we talked about when we were preparing for this episode and just thinking about this whole idea of leader member exchange and ostracism is how, there is a phenomenon that happens in groups if you're not careful as the leader, where you might start to kind of create some in groups and out groups, and maybe it's on purpose because you're a devious jerk. Don't do that. But
or you don't know better.
Right. Or you don't know better.
Yeah,
could happen, but it could happen kind of unintentionally, So for example, maybe some of the people who work for you just have a lot of things in common with you. Maybe they like the same sport or went to a similar university or something. So you talk with them about those things and just kind of develop a better relationship with them compared with the others. That starts to kind of create these in groups and out groups, though. And, what I'm wondering is, that how might that play into some of this ostracism, maybe from a non-purposeful perspective?
Great point. Absolutely. Yeah. So leaders can create what we call these fault lines, right, between the different subgroups in the organization. And so leaders do need to be very careful at how they interact with people, how they work with people, and who they're close with. So I had a boss one time. It was a great lesson to me. We had a lot in common. We hung out and watched baseball together. When he became my boss, he said, "Hey, we can't be quite as close as we used to be. I need to be a boss to everyone." And
it's not you, it's me.
Right. I couldn't, it was very strange. Yeah, it was very strange to hear that, but it was a great lesson to me, and something I did my best to live out as a manager, was that, everybody needs to be part of this team, and everybody brings something important. And I think as sort of an architect of the culture of your group or the culture of your organization, leadership really needs to think about, the strength of the culture. If it becomes too strong, it becomes, sort of a cult, right? Where the leaders, people are just vying to be close to the leader, and other perspectives, other people who may not fit in, are excluded and part of the out group. So that's something to be very careful about. I also, I think it's interesting. I don't know. I think you guys know this about me. I have a visual problem. So I have a visual retinal dystrophy that's causing me to lose my central vision. And I thought a lot about, in the process of whether to disclose this to people, whether to talk to people about this. And ultimately I came to the realization through listening to some very smart other folks who came before me in this regard, that said, you've got to tell folks, because you're going to walk into a coffee shop and you're going to see somebody, and you're going to walk right past them. You're going to have somebody in your class. So I have students who I'll see who work at the restaurants I go to in town, and I don't recognize them because I have trouble seeing faces and I have trouble with certain visual tasks. And so I know, as a researcher on this topic, that ostracism hurts people. And if I'm going to walk out the door and accidentally hurt somebody's feelings, I mean, I can get defensive about it and say, well, I didn't mean to, right? But that's what my 7-year-old says when he breaks something or spills some milk, right? He says, I didn't mean to. Well, it doesn't matter because it still hurt their feelings. It still caused them some pain. So I try to be as transparent as possible and remove that non-purposeful ostracism from the equation, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a very powerful and good personal example of that. And being mindful of these potential ways in which you could unintentionally be doing harm to other people. And if you're in a leadership position and you're, creating these in groups and out groups, not a good thing. Or any other way in which you might be intentionally or unintentionally, creating these dynamics in a group. So I guess that kind of leads us to this idea of, all right, so leaders are very important with dealing with ostracism and with potentially uh, keeping it from happening as frequently. What do we do if we are being personalized or ostracized? If you personally are being ostracized, what do I do? How do you kind of maintain your mental health? What are maybe some strategies that the research would suggest are helpful for you?
Absolutely. Well, so one of the things we found in our study that we think is important is social support, right? So your social support systems, are there people you can go to lean on in these times when you're having this difficulty, if you're being excluded from the group. So we think that your social support can be a very important thing to lean on to give you resilience when your psychological resources are being depleted by these experiences. So lean on those social support structures, both from a personal perspective, but also from a professional standpoint as well. You build a good network of colleagues and friends in your industry that, you can reach out to. And that idea of saying, yeah, this group here that I'm working with is excluding me. They don't, for whatever reason, want me to be part of this group. Understand that you're a valuable professional, and there are probably plenty of other groups out there that would want to have you. So leaning on that professional support network is really important as well. The other thing I'd say is you guys talked a little bit about this self-concept and your sort of this sense of having a complex self-identity, right? So playing lots of different roles. So I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a Cub Scout leader, I'm involved in in church, whatever you're involved in, have a very complex self-identity that allows you to sort of say, well, if I'm being excluded from this group, I'm part of plenty of other groups that see my value and that really I'm contributing to and really a part of. So those are some of the things I think that really resonate. I know Chris has mentioned to me in the past, to us in the past, the idea of differentiation. And Chris, I'll toss it to you if you want to.
Yeah, so I do this all the
that.
time with executives, and this comes from the personal psychology literature, but I think it's so applicable to anybody that's navigating the work environment. Or if you're heading up the ship, to your point, the manager, hey, I'm the man now, can't be hanging out, watching baseball every day, playing favorites, right? And so it's this idea, and you can actually help your kids when you're raising them to be able to stand on their own 2 feet and to be able to be themselves in the presence of others and not be infected by others people's emotional states. Because sometimes you come in and there's a neurotic person there, or somebody that's having a hard time, or maybe depressed or something. And if you're always thinking, oh my gosh, what did I do? This person isn't happy. It's all my fault. It's me. Like you are now on this roller coaster ride at the behest of everybody else's emotion, and it doesn't give yourself stability. But I've seen people walk in, be the excluded, ostracized person, stand on their own 2 feet, self-validate the kind of person they want to be, stick to their moral compass, and like a vortex, everybody comes in and starts following. Even now, that person's setting the norms for the groups, right? But that person was more differentiated than those around them. And so if you're in a leadership position, you're going to helm an organization or group of individuals. You got to be your own person and guide. Now, you want to learn the norms, and you might use those as a tools to accomplish certain missions, but it's this idea of being on your own 2 feet. Now, there's some people that are such loners, they're probably over differentiated. We don't, and it's a fantasy to think that you'll be so differentiated that you have no need of others. Matter of fact, if you're seeking out that kind of differentiation, not only are you missing out on a massive part of the human experience, that opportunity to really be connected with the people around you, the sweetness of life. This is all the humanities talks about this. This is what culture is about, is that connection piece. So you don't want to, if you're seeking that out, and it's like, I will not be infected by anybody. I will be a robot automaton. No, you're going too far. That's the wrong idea. And also, just for some grace for yourself, you're like, man, if I was more of the ultimate executive, I could just, not be bothered. We all have different psychological profiles. Our hearts can be moved and frustrated. Ben and I were dealing with a situation this week with a friend, and wish that friend had reached out in a kind way, and they had not. And it kind of burned a bridge, and it hurt us. Like you see the mobster in the mob movies, right? They're like, we'll fit them for concrete shoes. It doesn't bother me. But that's not true. That's a facade for most people. So as we navigate life, we both have to stand on our own 2 feet, have a moral compass, discover who we are. That will give us resilience. It doesn't mean that our feelings won't get hurt. That'll give us resilience to chart our course and keep a clear mind. Don't go for the robot approach. You want to keep that soft. So, but anyway, I think our listeners got it. I love differentiation. You need to check that stuff out.
So, I think that's a really good point to make and a good part of this conversation. And, one thing I'm also wondering and thinking about as we're talking about, if you're being ostracized, we talked about how, Josh, you mentioned, it's a good idea to maybe focus on trying to improve that relationship with your supervisor. So as long as that supervisor isn't kind of doing it on purpose. I've had students who have had situations, and I've been around other people who have, where it is the leader and that supervisor is intentionally ostracizing or creating a toxic environment. So maybe we could brainstorm a little bit. So if you're out there and your boss, your supervisor is intentionally ostracizing you, maybe what are some strategies that
punch him in the face. The first time, and you can't wait. Don't do it on the second time. You're like, are you ostracizing me? I mean, pick up a stapler and a heavy book.
No, we're not advocating
just
any
fantasize
kind of violence
about it. Don't actually do it.
Yeah, you could
go to HR first. Talk to HR before you pick up a heavy book.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's a good point, right? You there are resources in your organization usually. Right. Be it through your human resources department or, maybe it's your boss's boss that you need to talk to.
Sure.
And, those are, if it's not going to work out, like, that's a time when it's totally okay and appropriate for you to jump the chain of command, so to speak, right? If it's not working out. So, otherwise it can be really hard to live under that kind of environment.
Absolutely, yes. But especially if it's that purposeful ostracism, you're probably in a dysfunctional supervisor-employee relationship. So I think your point, going to the boss's boss, is a good one, especially if you're aware of the cultural values of the organization, and if it's a very aggressive place and the values are around, performance and challenging, you're going to have certain behaviors. People are going to behave in certain ways that uphold those values. If you have values of dignity and respect, and you're not being respected and you're not being made to feel part of the group, then that supervisor is violating the corporate values, the organization's values. And so presumably, if others in the chain of command above that individual would want to know that a supervisor is not living up to the corporate values. So that is a good example, Ben.
Yeah.
So I want to share a story about punching in the face, all right? Since we're all riled up over here. So I changed schools so many times. I was kind of like, okay, this is the part where I'm the numbskull that's excluded, right? And generally what I do just to avoid it is just seek out, the other ostracized people right away. And, I went to a lot of Christian schools and I could say, wait a minute, that's not the Christian way to act. You kind of throw some of their values back in their face. And it's like, why aren't you guys more friends with these guys? If you don't want to sit at their table, I don't want to sit at yours, right? Good offense is a nice defense. I remember I was at this one Christian school. It was in Huntsville, Alabama. We had actually just moved there. And it was like, oh my gosh, this is like the South for reals. And so I'm there. Nobody talked to me for 4 days. They would just look, point, and laugh and cold shoulder. And so like I was sitting at the far end. It was just like, well, at least I'm not getting physically harassed. So in those first few days, everybody knows that dynamic of where do you end up sitting for the whole school year? In the same spot that gets established in that first week, because I don't know, the pecking order gets established. I don't know what the stupid stuff that goes on. I'd like to sit someplace different each day and talk to it, pass notes and get in trouble with a different person, equal opportunity type numbskullery. So I go to sit down in this chair, and I'd sat in here I sat there for the last 3 days. And this guy, he's on the football team. He comes over and he's like, hey, you're sitting in my chair. And at this point, I'm done. I'm emotionally taxed. I don't have the reserves to not say something. And I'm like, well, I didn't see your freaking name on it. And he dropped his books and just kind of was like, I didn't even hesitate. I took my textbook and I went, bam, right up the side of his face. And I'm going for a 1, a 2, and I'm about to land a 3rd one in his face. And then I'm looking up at the ceiling. I'm like, what happened? Well, thankfully it wasn't him. It was another one of the football players that pulled me down from behind, and I was kind of like, a couple seconds, like, seeing colors and stuff. Teacher comes in. All right, guys, to the office. So we go to the office, and it's the football coach is the interim principal. And he's like, you can tell he doesn't want that job. He's like, oh God, a disciplinary thing I got to do. And it's one of his football players, which was good. And he says, all right, so what happens? And I just told him, I said, listen, nobody's talking to me at this school. And, this place can go jump in a lake. Christian school, my rear, blah, 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 blah. And then it's like, is this true what happened? He's going, well, doing the timid leg, looking at the ground. So he can't lose his good football guy, right? I know this is such a long story. Ben will probably have me edit it out.
No,
but he said, all right, you guys got to sit and do lunch together for 2 weeks. And then I want you to write a paper on each other's life. And so there it's me and the football guy. Now I'm not sitting by myself at the lunch table, right?
Wow.
But after that, it reset the dynamic. People started talking to me.
Wow.
And I that's probably not in the literature, like using physical violence to stop bad LMX behaviors. But there's these ideas. There's a script that everybody's running on of ostracism. I've seen executives to where it's like, if I don't see that guy fire somebody in the first month of taking that role, I don't think he's decisive enough. What's that based on? I've seen military officers say the thing, if he can't be a stern disciplinarian, well, what if his team is awesome and high performing? That sometimes you got to break these scripts. And this is not in the literature. This is just completely anecdotal. People behave on these rails. They're used to these social norms. And sometimes if you can interdict those social norms, introduce new values, paint a new vision of another way forward, those things could be helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I'll be sure I'll be sure to let you sit wherever you want to sit, Chris. I don't want you to. You have a lot
I will not be ostracizing.
I've got again. I was more notorious and popular. If I know about the downtrodden and what to do with the downtrodden in organizations, it's because I was that guy. Yeah. So let's all right. Back on topic. So let's talk about what leaders should do to avoid ostracizing others, and let's talk about it both intentionally and unintentionally.
Sure. So we talked a little bit earlier about how some people think that using ostracism as a way to sort of modify other people's behavior is an effective way. Our research, and which obviously is based on a lot of other people's research, tells us it's not. It's just not effective. So don't be a numbskull. Stop doing it. Stop using it as an attempt to modify people's behavior, because it's going to be counterproductive. It's not going to get you the results that you're looking for. And you guys have talked on the podcast a lot about, firms and organizations don't invest in leadership development. They just, I think you said, Chris, one time, a monkey see, monkey do approach to learning leadership. And so you see other people use these behaviors and you're I don't have anything else in my toolbox, so I'll pull out ostracism. Well, ostracism doesn't belong in your toolbox as a leader. So don't use it if you are using it purposefully. Of course, there are people who use it purposefully just as a way of dominating or showing power over others. They're probably not listening to this show, right? Because, those are people who don't want to see other people flourish, right? So those are maybe more HR interventions where the organization can do a better job maybe of selecting people for leadership roles. As Ben mentioned, looking for supervisors who are not living up to those values of inclusion, those values of sort of making people feel respected, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there may be a role for HR there to improve those practices and focus on really good leadership, evidence-based leadership, leadership development and training practices.
Yeah.
So that would be from sort of the intentional side, what the organization might do to help leaders get better and not use this as a tactic. On the unintentional side, we see a couple of things. And again, the literature here, we're extending, this is sort of theoretical at this point. We don't have a whole lot of empirical evidence on this side because we're really just developing measures to figure out how to measure unintentional ostracism or non-purposeful ostracism.
Because we can't read minds.
Right. So we're trying some ways to develop some measures that might capture this a little bit. But until we've got more empirical data, what we think are a couple of the things that lead to non-purposeful ostracism are time pressures. So you think about a boss who's really busy, and I've done this before as a manager, and I think back to conversations where people got their feelings hurt because I just walked past them in a hallway. And, in my initial reaction when somebody said, I think somebody got their feelings hurt because you didn't talk to him this morning. My initial reaction was, well, I was busy. I was really busy. I had a lot of time pressure. I just couldn't talk to him. I didn't need to be bothered, right? Well, that is not a way to react. That minimizes the other person's feelings, and really it doesn't take responsibility for your own behavior, your own actions. So to the extent that if you have time pressure in your life as a leader, it doesn't excuse being busy, doesn't excuse being rude, right? So think about that, and think about how when you are feeling very busy, when you are maybe potentially ignoring some of your people, how can I carve out 5 or 10 minutes to recover that opportunity to go back and talk to that person, to check in with them, see how they're doing. How do I work that into my schedule as a leader to really help people feel included? The other piece that we think is related to this unintentional ostracism is this idea of diversity, actually. So what I'm talking about is cognitive diversity. So the way we all think about or have different mental models about what's appropriate behavior. So, Chris, you might have been
I need some better ones of those, huh?
So for instance, if you're in an IT position, right, at one firm, and you're called in to fix a projector during a really important meeting, in that setting, the social norms might be for the CEO to introduce you around to the people in the room and talk about how great the IT department is and really help you feel included. You walk into your next job, you move to a different organization, and you're called in to fix the projector, and everyone ignores you and just assumes that you're just in the background
You're the
doing
help.
what you need to do. You're the help, right? those are two completely different social norms, and you might feel ostracized in that second setting because you've not been included, but it's just not the way they do things in this new organization. So you have different mental models about what's appropriate behavior, and that can lead you to feel ostracized even though you haven't necessarily been. So in this case,
differentiation is important in my view.
Absolutely.
Because you just don't know. You need more data points and some initial interactions to form, these guys think I'm horrible, or I'm all right. I just, they're different over here than my last place, right? That differentiation, if you focus on that personal resilience, you're not going to be as infected. And that's going to give, like, the organization. So if you're a leader, you get to take a pause of, ooh, I can't blaze down this hallway to my next meeting and be like, hey, Fred, I'm in a hurry, but let me check you after I get out of this meeting. Like, okay, cool. You have those tactical pauses. Differentiation is a tactical pause before you let yourself go through that gauntlet of hurt, shame, and the pain and the rejection, right?
That is a great example. Yeah, great way to put it. And as an organization, so that would be on your own personal level. If you're feeling ostracized, lean on your differentiation, take that tactical pause. As an organization, what we can do is create better socialization practices when we bring new people into the organization. So help them understand not just, where's the bathroom? How do I get my parking pass? Put them through the sexual harassment training and the ethics training, but really give them a sense of what are our values as an organization? How do we treat each other? What are the cultural norms in this organization? Really help people understand through that socialization process what it is appropriate social behavior.
That's fantastic. One thing that I've been wondering, thinking about this idea of ostracism and how you can prevent it is, it's right now we're in a crazy time where many more people are working from home, working remotely, and that's probably going to continue for a while. Either because COVID will continue or because organizations realize that, hey, this actually works pretty well. We don't really need you to be at the office. And yet so much of our socio-emotional well-being sometimes comes from our interactions with coworkers. So I don't know I'm sure we don't have any research on this yet, just because it's so new. But with regard to virtual work, how can maybe leaders do some extra stuff, perhaps to avoid unintentionally, perhaps ostracizing folks?
Sure. This is a really interesting question. So my wife is a virtual worker. She was a virtual worker before COVID. And so she was interacting primarily with people back at corporate headquarters. And she felt ostracized a lot because people just wouldn't think to invite her to a meeting,
right?
Or, bring her into a conversation at the front end where she could have some input in things. It was always at the very last minute. Oh yeah, we should really tell Aaron about this. So out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. And so she felt that a lot. And so there are going to be many consequences for sort of team cohesion, team trust in this virtual world. I'm sort of curious to see what the literature does come up with, because there's a difference between a virtual worker who's interacting with people in the office and a situation in which everyone is virtual, right?
Right.
I do think there is some initial evidence that people are more attentive to sort of task-related stuff in the virtual world as opposed to the interpersonal type stuff. Mm-hmm. And so there might be a little bit of a loss of that
connection. Yeah.
But it would be very overly speculative of me. And as a researcher, I don't know what we'll find, but I do think it brings some interesting dynamics.
And I absolutely appreciate that. I think, probably one thing that we could say for sure is that you're not going to do any harm as a leader by reaching out to your folks on a regular basis. All of your folks, not just a couple of them, reach out to your folks on a regular basis to see how they're doing, right? That can't hurt in a virtual environment or a non-virtual environment. So, take care of your people and they'll take care of you, I think is certainly a takeaway that all leaders should take with regard to this. So,
Absolutely.
the other thing that you had mentioned, and I think is worth mentioning with regard to dealing with ostracism, is just this role of social support and kind of building that group, those various groups that you're a member of, and finding those people who support you for being you.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really important. I mean, not just in the workplace, but in life in general. Psychologists, over these long longitudinal studies find that one of the most important things to longevity in life is social connections, right?
Hmm.
And having these complex social identities, having strong family and social support systems, and even if you have come from challenging family dynamics, right? You can find your people. Right, you can find your people, the people that help you feel strong, that help you feel confident, and really in cases where you're feeling excluded from one certain group, go be part of that other group, right? Go lean on that other group for some of that belonging and some of that support. And you'll be much more resilient. You'll be better able to differentiate yourself because you've got that platform, that foundation to build upon, right?
Yeah,
That's
we need
fantastic.
connection. No person should be an island. Now there's a lane, a left and right limit there, but that is where the sweetness of life is. The campaign I think about is the LGBT campaign. That it gets better. That
Right.
lots
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
problems with youth suicide for young queer kids, and it's a shame. Same thing. If I found my group with the software development crowd. We just got dumpster diving for manuals and writing code. And, I'd go to school, and that wasn't what most people's jam was, but that was fine. Find your people. They're out there. Or
Mhm.
find somebody like Ben that'll put up with you.
Maybe I try. So, this has been a fantastic conversation, and some things that we've talked about today is we really introduced this idea of ostracism and talked about why it matters really greatly in the workplace. We talked about some of those outcomes of ostracism at the individual and the organizational level. And then we've unpacked some of these different things that lead to ostracism and some of the implications that it has for leaders and for people in organizations. So, Josh, anything else that you want to share with our listeners, or where people can find you maybe on the web?
Sure. Well, thank you guys again for having me, and really think this is an important topic as we've talked about, the importance of inclusion, right? And to me, inclusion is really important from a personal standpoint, but a social, organizational standpoint as well. So thanks for inviting me to have this conversation with y'all. If you want to reach me, find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect with you and talk to you more about this, or any other topics related to organizational psychology. So thanks again for having me, guys.
Josh, it is an honor to have you on this show, and this research. I mean, obviously, we all got emotional during this episode. It's just so important, and to put yourself out there and to do research in this space is really making the world a better place. So we're humbled that you came and we're our guests. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.